The South China Sea, July 1945. 300 feet beneath the surface, USS Barb cuts through the dark water like a steel predator. Inside the cramped submarine, 80 men breathe recycled air and listen to the rhythmic ping of sonar. They are hunter-killers, stalking Japanese shipping lanes, sending enemy vessels to the bottom of the Pacific. But Commander Eugene Fluckey has a problem, a magnificent, infuriating problem. His submarine is too successful, his crew too deadly. After months of combat patrols, after sinking dozens of Japanese ships, the targets are running out. The enemy has learned to avoid certain waters. Convoys travel only with heavy escort. The hunting grounds that once teemed with prey have gone quiet. Fluckey is not a man who accepts limitations. He is one of the most aggressive submarine commanders in the U.S. Navy, a captain who will push his boat and his crew to the absolute edge of possibility to strike at the enemy. He has received 4 Navy Crosses, the nation's second highest decoration for valor. But medals don't sink ships, and ships are what win wars. So Fluckey starts thinking differently. If the enemy won't come to the water, perhaps the water should come to the enemy. What if a submarine could attack targets on land? What if those tons of high explosives sitting in the torpedo room could be used in ways no one had ever imagined? What if 80 American submariners could do something so audacious, so unprecedented, that it would become legend? This is the story of how American submariners sank a Japanese train without firing a shot. This is the story of Operation Barb, the most unconventional submarine mission of World War II. And this is the story of the night a locomotive met its end not from bombs or artillery, but from a weapon it never saw coming, a weapon that approached from the sea. To understand what happened on that July night in 1945, you need to understand Commander Eugene Bennett Fluckey. Born in 1913, Fluckey graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1935 and spent his early career on surface ships. But when war came to America in December 1941, Fluckey knew where he wanted to be. Submarines. The silent service. The undersea warriors who would carry the fight directly into Japanese-controlled waters. By 1943, Fluckey had worked his way up to command of USS Barb, a Gato-class submarine, 311 feet of welded steel, diesel engines, and torpedo tubes. The Barb was a proven killer, but under Fluckey's command, it would become legendary. Fluckey's philosophy was simple and terrifying. Be aggressive, be creative, and never, ever stop attacking. While other submarine commanders might break off an attack if conditions weren't perfect, Fluckey pressed forward. While others avoided shallow water or heavily defended areas, Fluckey went exactly where the enemy thought no submarine would dare to go. On one patrol, Fluckey took Barb into a Japanese harbor in broad daylight to attack anchored ships. On another, he surfaced during a convoy attack to use his deck gun at point-blank range. His crew called him Lucky Fluckey, though luck had little to do with it. He was meticulous in planning, brutal in execution, and absolutely committed to bringing his men home alive. By early 1945, Fluckey and the Barb had sunk over 30 Japanese vessels. They had dodged depth charges, survived air attacks, and operated in some of the most dangerous waters of the Pacific. The crew trusted their captain completely. They knew that when Fluckey said, "Follow me into hell," he meant it, and he'd get them back out. But now, in the final months of the war, the hunting was getting harder. Japan's merchant fleet was nearly destroyed. The remaining ships traveled only in heavily escorted convoys or hugged the coastline where submarines couldn't easily reach them. American submariners were running out of targets. Fluckey looked at maps of the Japanese home islands and the occupied territories. He studied intelligence reports. He talked with his officers. And slowly, an idea began to form, an idea so radical that it would require special permission from the highest levels of command. If he couldn't find ships to sink, he would find something else. He would take the war to land. He would make USS Barb not just a submarine, but a commando raiding force. The United States Navy had never done anything like this before, but that had never stopped Eugene Fluckey.
Fluckey presented his idea to his superiors. USS Barb would conduct shore bombardment and, if possible, landing operations against Japanese coastal installations, not just shelling from offshore, actual landing parties going ashore to sabotage enemy infrastructure. The admirals were skeptical. Submarines were designed to sink ships, not fight on land. The crew had no training as commandos. The risks were enormous. If men were captured during the shore operation, they could be executed as spies rather than treated as prisoners of war. But Fluckey had already thought through every objection. He would train volunteers from his crew, they would strike only lightly defended targets, They would move fast, hit hard, and be back aboard before the enemy could react. And most importantly, the psychological impact on Japan would be devastating. If American submarines could strike inland targets at will, nowhere would be safe. Reluctantly, permission was granted. USS Barb would become the Navy's first submarine raiding vessel. Fluckey immediately began training. He selected 8 volunteers from his crew, men who were physically fit, cool under pressure, and willing to risk their lives on an experimental mission. They practiced beach landings, demolition techniques, and small unit tactics. They trained with the submarine surfaced, timing how quickly they could deploy and recover men using rubber rafts. The crew fabricated a special rocket launcher that could be mounted on the submarine's deck, allowing Barb to fire salvos at shore targets before withdrawing. They tested explosive charges. They studied maps of the Japanese coastline, looking for the perfect target. And then Fluckey found it. Not a port, not a factory. Something even better. A railroad. The Karafuto Railway ran along the eastern coast of Karafuto, the Japanese name for the southern half of Sakhalin Island, north of Japan. This railroad was a critical supply line, moving troops, ammunition, and resources from Manchuria down to the home islands. Trains ran regularly, often at night, to avoid American air attacks. If a submarine crew could get ashore, reach the railroad, and plant explosives on the tracks, they could derail a train. The propaganda value alone would be enormous, but more importantly, it would demonstrate that American forces could strike anywhere, that no part of Japan's empire was beyond reach. Fluckey gathered his officers and volunteers. He showed them the maps. He explained the plan. And then he asked for objections. There were none. The crew of USS Barb was ready to make history. On July 18, 1945, USS Barb began its 12th war patrol. The submarine slipped out of Pearl Harbor and headed west, into the Sea of Okhotsk and the waters around Sakhalin Island. These were dangerous waters, cold, frequently foggy, and heavily patrolled by Japanese aircraft and anti-submarine vessels. Fluckey took his boat north, far from the usual submarine operating areas. For days, Barb hunted in the shallows off Sakhalin, looking for targets. They shelled shore installations. They used their deck-mounted rockets to bombard coastal villages, and they searched for the perfect spot to execute their land raid. On July 22nd, they found it. A small bay near the village of Shari-Misaki. The railroad ran close to the coastline here, just a few hundred yards from the water. There were no major military installations nearby, which meant lighter enemy presence. The terrain was manageable, wooded but not impenetrable, and intelligence reports suggested that trains passed through regularly, especially at night. This was it. This was where American submariners would become saboteurs. Fluckey surfaced Barb just after midnight on July 23rd. The night was dark, the moon hidden behind clouds, perfect conditions for a covert landing. The sea was calm enough for the rubber rafts they would use to reach shore. 8 men volunteered for the landing party. Lieutenant William Walker would lead them. They were armed with pistols and knives, but their real weapons were in the packs they carried. 55 pounds of plastic explosives, time-delay detonators, and improvised mines fashioned from torpedo warheads.
The plan was simple, but required perfect timing. The team would paddle ashore, move inland to the railroad tracks, plant explosives designed to derail any train that passed over them, and return to the submarine before dawn. Total time ashore, 90 minutes maximum. If anything went wrong, if they were discovered, if Japanese patrols spotted them, if they couldn't make it back to the beach in time, Fluckey would have to make an impossible choice. Wait for his men and risk losing the submarine, or dive and leave them behind. As the landing party climbed into the rubber rafts, Fluckey gave them one final instruction. Do your job and get back alive. That's an order. The rafts disappeared into the darkness, heading toward the Japanese shore. If you're enjoying this journey through history, remember to subscribe to WW2 Last Stand, where we bring forgotten battles, hidden stories, and untold final stands of World War II back to life. Lieutenant Walker and his 7 men paddled silently toward the beach. Every sound seemed impossibly loud. The dip of paddles in water, the rustle of equipment, the nervous breathing of men about to set foot on enemy territory. Behind them, USS Barb waited, dark and silent, ready to dive at the first sign of danger. The rafts scraped onto the beach. The men climbed out, pulled the rafts up into the tree line, and froze, listening. No voices, no sounds of alarm, just the wind in the trees and the distant crash of waves. They moved inland, following a compass bearing toward the railroad. The terrain was rougher than expected, thick underbrush, uneven ground, treacherous in the darkness. They couldn't use flashlights for fear of being spotted. Every step had to be careful, deliberate. 20 minutes of careful movement brought them to the railroad embankment. And there it was, 2 parallel steel rails stretching off into the darkness.
the lifeline of Japanese supply operations on Sakhalin Island. The demolition team got to work immediately. Using their knives, they dug under one of the rails, creating a space for the explosive charges. The plastic explosives were molded around the rail and connected to a microswitch trigger, a crude but effective device. When a train's weight pressed down on the rail, it would complete the circuit and detonate the charges. But there was a problem. The charges they had brought might not be enough to guarantee derailment. Lieutenant Walker made a command decision. They would use additional charges from their packs and rig a second detonation point further down the track. If one didn't get the train, the other would. As the team worked, one man was posted as lookout. He heard it first, a distant sound growing steadily louder, a rhythmic chugging, the hiss of steam, the metallic squeal of wheels on rails. A train was coming. Now. The demolition team had two choices: finish the job and risk being caught in the blast, or abandon the mission and return to the submarine. Lieutenant Walker didn't hesitate. They had come too far to fail now. He ordered his men to work faster. The explosives were set, the microswitches were armed, the wires were connected, and the sound of the approaching train was getting louder, closer, undeniable. "Move," Walker hissed. "Back to the beach, now." The 8 men scrambled down the embankment and ran. They crashed through underbrush, stumbled over roots, pushed themselves to move faster than they'd ever moved before. Behind them, the sound of the train grew to a roar. The locomotive was close, maybe a minute away from the sabotage section of track. They burst out of the tree line and onto the beach. The rubber rafts were where they'd left them. They dragged them into the water, piled in, and paddled with desperate speed toward the dark shape of USS Barb waiting offshore. And then, from behind them, came the explosion.
The blast lit up the night sky like a flash of lightning. A massive detonation that echoed across the water, followed by the screeching, tearing sound of metal being ripped apart. The train, a locomotive pulling 16 freight cars loaded with Japanese troops and supplies, hit the sabotaged section of track at full speed. The explosives detonated perfectly. The rail disintegrated. The locomotive's front wheels dropped into the gap, and the entire massive machine pitched forward, pulling the cars behind it into a cascading pile of twisted steel and shattered wood. The boiler exploded, sending a geyser of superheated steam into the air. Cars telescoped into each other. Cargo and personnel were thrown in every direction. The American saboteurs, still paddling frantically toward their submarine, watched the destruction they had caused. Flames rose from the wreckage. Smaller secondary explosions continued as ammunition and fuel inside the freight cars ignited. The entire train was destroyed, transformed in seconds from a functioning military transport into a burning ruin. On board USS Barb, Commander Fluckey and the crew heard the explosion. They saw the flash light up the shoreline, and they cheered. Against all odds, the mission had succeeded. American submariners had just destroyed a Japanese train without firing a shot, using nothing but explosives, courage, and perfect timing. The rubber rafts reached the submarine. The landing party was hauled aboard, exhausted but triumphant. Fluckey ordered an immediate dive. Within minutes, USS Barb was back beneath the surface, disappearing into the depths before Japanese forces could respond. As the submarine headed away from Sakhalin Island, the crew celebrated their historic achievement. They had done something no submarine crew had ever done before. They had taken the war to land. They had proven that American ingenuity and daring could strike anywhere, anytime, in any way. But for Commander Fluckey, this was just the beginning. The success of the railroad sabotage mission proved that submarines could conduct unconventional operations. It opened the door to new tactics, new strategies, new ways of bringing the war to Japan's doorstep. USS Barb would conduct several more shore bombardments and rocket attacks before returning to Pearl Harbor in August 1945. By the time the submarine completed its 12th patrol, it had earned the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest unit award in the U.S. military, and Commander Fluckey had received the Medal of Honor for his extraordinary leadership and courage. The train derailment on Sakhalin Island remained classified for years after the war. When the story finally became public, it captured the imagination of historians and military enthusiasts. How American submariners sank a Japanese train without firing a shot became one of the most remarkable and unusual stories of World War II, a testament to creative thinking,
calculated risk-taking, and the determination of men who refused to accept that anything was impossible. The destruction of that train on a dark night in July 1945 was more than just a successful sabotage operation. It was a demonstration of a principle that had driven the American war effort in the Pacific. Audacity wins wars. When Commander Fluckey looked at a map and saw a railroad running near the coast, he didn't see an impossible target. He saw an opportunity. When his superiors hesitated, he pressed forward with detailed plans and careful preparation. When his men volunteered for an operation that could easily have ended in their deaths, they did so because they trusted their captain and believed in the mission. This kind of thinking, this refusal to be bound by conventional limitations, characterized the best of American military leadership during World War II. From Doolittle's raid on Tokyo to the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, American forces succeeded not just because of superior resources, but because of superior imagination. The Japanese military, for all its courage and tactical skill, often suffered from rigid thinking. Doctrine was sacred. Plans were followed even when circumstances changed. Innovation was discouraged in favor of adherence to established methods. The American military, by contrast, rewarded initiative. Officers like Fluckey, who proposed unconventional operations, weren't court-martialed. They were given medals. Sailors who volunteered for dangerous experimental missions weren't considered reckless. They were considered heroes. This cultural difference mattered. It meant that American forces could adapt, improvise, and overcome challenges in ways the enemy couldn't predict or counter. And it meant that a submarine crew could become commandos, that torpedoes could be replaced with rockets, and that a train could be destroyed by a weapon that approached from the sea.
USS Barb completed 12 war patrols during World War II. The submarine sank 17 Japanese ships, totaling over 96,000 tons. It damaged dozens more. It pioneered the use of submarine-launched rockets against shore targets, and it executed the only successful land raid by a submarine crew in U.S. Navy history. Commander Eugene Fluckey became one of the most decorated officers of the war. In addition to his Medal of Honor, he received 4 Navy Crosses, 3 Legion of Merit Awards, and numerous other decorations. After the war, he continued to serve in the Navy, eventually retiring as a Rear Admiral in 1972. But Fluckey never forgot his crew. In interviews and memoirs written decades later, he always emphasized that the success of USS Barb was a team effort. The officers who planned operations, the enlisted men who maintained the boat under impossible conditions, the torpedo men who kept the weapons ready, the engine men who coaxed maximum performance from aging diesel engines, every man aboard contributed to the submarine's legendary record. The 8 sailors who went ashore on Sakhalin Island that night in July 1945 returned to civilian life after the war. Most never spoke publicly about their experience. It was a classified operation, and even when the details were eventually released, the men who had actually done it remained modest about their achievement. But they had been part of something extraordinary. They had proven that ordinary men, given proper leadership and training, could accomplish extraordinary things. They had demonstrated that courage wasn't about the absence of fear, it was about doing your duty despite fear. USS Barb was decommissioned in 1954 and eventually scrapped, but the submarine's legacy lived on. The tactics pioneered by Fluckey and his crew influenced submarine warfare for decades. The emphasis on aggressive action, creative thinking, and unconventional operations became part of submarine service culture. Today, submarines in the U.S. Navy can launch cruise missiles at land targets, deploy special operations forces, and conduct covert reconnaissance missions. These capabilities trace their lineage directly back to that night in 1945, when 8 men climbed into rubber rafts and paddled toward a Japanese-held shore, carrying explosives and determination in equal measure. War is often discussed in terms of strategy, technology, and national policy. We talk about weapon systems, tactical advantages, and geopolitical objectives. But at its core, war is always about people, individuals making decisions, taking risks, and living with the consequences. The story of how American submariners sank a Japanese train without firing a shot is ultimately a story about people. It's about Commander Fluckey, who refused to accept that submarines had to operate only according to established doctrine. It's about Lieutenant Walker and the 7 men who followed him ashore, knowing they might not come back. It's about the crew of USS Barb who waited in their steel tube beneath the surface, ready to dive and save the boat, even if it meant leaving their shipmates behind. And it's also about the Japanese soldiers on that train. We don't know their names, we don't know their stories, but they were people too, men serving their country, following orders, trying to survive a war that was already lost. When the explosives detonated and the train derailed, some of them died. Others were injured. All of them experienced the terror of sudden, unexpected violence. War creates these moments of impossible complexity. The same action that makes 8 American sailors heroes means death and suffering for dozens of Japanese soldiers. The success of one side is built on the tragedy of the other, and there is no way to resolve this moral tension. It simply exists, a fundamental truth of armed conflict.
What we can do is remember both sides. We can honor the courage of the American submariners while acknowledging the humanity of the Japanese soldiers. We can celebrate innovation and daring while recognizing the terrible cost of war. And we can study these stories not to glorify combat, but to understand what people are capable of, both the best and the worst, when pushed to extremes.
Commander Fluckey understood this. In his memoirs, he wrote about the enemy with respect. He never trivialized the violence his submarine inflicted. He recognized that sinking a ship meant killing sailors, that destroying a train meant ending lives. But he also understood that his duty was to his country, his crew, and the mission. He lived with that complexity for the rest of his life. The railroad tracks on Sakhalin Island were repaired within days. Trains ran again, carrying their cargo of war. But something had changed. The psychological impact of the raid rippled through Japanese military circles. If a submarine could land commandos on their shores, if even a railroad wasn't safe from American attack, where could they feel secure? USS Barb continued its patrol, hunting for more targets, looking for more ways to bring the war to Japan. 2 weeks after the train derailment, atomic bombs would fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war would end, and the men of USS Barb would go home, carrying with them the memory of that night when they proved that no target was out of reach, that no conventional limitation could bind men determined to do the impossible. Today, the story of how American submariners sank a Japanese train without firing a shot remains one of the most unusual and inspiring tales of World War II. It reminds us that war is not just about firepower and resources. It's about imagination, courage, and the willingness to try something that's never been done before. Eugene Fluckey passed away in 2007 at the age of 93. He had lived to see his beloved submarine service evolve into the high-tech force it is today. He had watched nuclear submarines replace diesel boats, cruise missiles replace deck guns, and sophisticated electronics replace the simple periscopes of his era. But the spirit of USS Barb, the aggressive, innovative, never-say-die attitude that made that July night in 1945 possible, that spirit endures. It lives on in every submarine crew that takes their boat into dangerous waters. It lives on in every special operations team that goes ashore to accomplish the impossible. And it lives on in the story we tell today of 8 men in rubber rafts carrying explosives toward a railroad track, proving that courage and creativity can change the course of history. This is why we remember USS Barb. This is why we honor Commander Fluckey and his crew, not just because they sank ships or destroyed a train, but because they showed us what humans can accomplish when they refuse to accept limitations, when they trust each other completely, and when they commit themselves to a cause larger than themselves. The train is long gone. The submarine is scrapped. The men who were there have mostly passed away. But the story remains, a testament to audacity, innovation, and the extraordinary things that ordinary people can do when pushed to the edge of possibility. If this story inspired you, join us at WW2 Last Stand for more incredible tales from the Second World War. Subscribe to explore the forgotten battles, the untold heroism, and the moments that defined a generation. These stories deserve to be remembered. These heroes deserve to be honored. And the lessons they taught us about courage, innovation, and the human spirit are lessons we need today more than ever. Thank you for watching, and never forget the men who went to war in steel tubes beneath the sea, who faced impossible odds with unwavering courage, and who showed us that even a train can be sunk if you're creative enough, brave enough, and determined enough to try.